class. And as always, I wanted to say how much I have enjoyed teaching this class. Of all the things I've taught in my years at MIT briefly, Stanford for a number of years, Naval Postgraduate School, and here, this is by far, I think, the most rewarding class I have ever taught. It's been, of course, a great privilege to work with Professor Nacht throughout this. It's very thought-provoking. These are hard problems. Every year when we give the capstone project, it seems that the world is in a different place, and making progress even seems to be more difficult. Sadly, I think this is the world we're bequeathing to you. But I'm very encouraged by the number of people, undergraduates and graduate students of the whole spectrum of studies here at Berkeley, learn about this course and take part on it. It is quite a popular course. I'm very pleased about that. Now, first comment, I'm not quite sure when Professor Stan Pearson and Michael Nacht first got together and conspired to teach this class, which I think would have been about 2013, Michael?
Right, 2012, yeah. Right.
What was the general concept? But in my mind, I think there is, not only I think this is an interesting class for people to take, whether from STEM fields or policy, but I have my own subtext or kind of secondary agenda in this class, and which I think has been borne out. And that is that no matter what you are doing, whether you're a nuclear engineer, whether you're a chemical engineer, whether you're in political science or economics, I want this class to be an opportunity for you to think about doing something that perhaps you hadn't thought about before, which is the idea that you personally may direct your career towards nonproliferation and national security more broadly. And in years past, I'm very pleased to say, I'm very encouraged that many of our students, in fact, particularly those in nuclear engineering, have gone on to work for the intelligence community. They've gone on to work for the Department of State. We've had people that have gone for careers in the NNSA, which is the principal steward, in fact, the steward of everything having to do with nuclear weapons and nuclear nonproliferation, assessment of other countries, and so forth. And in fact, it's not rare. In fact, we've had many of our students who I think were so captured by this class that they've actually gone on and directed their careers towards really getting a chance not simply to do a capstone project in the classroom, but to really spend many years grappling with these problems in a position where they have the power and the capability to really affect something. I hope you took notice of Professor Kemp's lecture, fresh out of graduate school. He all of a sudden ended up in the State Department and was at the right place at the right time, the right person to end up in a real pivotal place in history, which was negotiating a major treaty, the JPCOA. And that's something that you will have the opportunity to do. You probably know, I think our students in nuclear engineering are aware of, there are very specific opportunities. Many students come and talk to me about these NNSA fellowships. And we also have the graduate, people who are doing their graduate school can apply to be the NNSA graduate fellows as well and spend time each summer working at either in headquarters or at Los Alamos or Livermore or Sandia or somewhere else in the complex. They are similar fellowships, graduate fellowships in the intelligence community and so forth. If any of this is attractive to you and you sort of are so interested, please see Professor Nacht or myself, and we can connect you with these opportunities, both at the time of you're doing your graduate studies or even post-bac, and certainly when you begin to, to apply for jobs. I spend a lot of my time writing letters of recommendation for people, and also probably every 2 weeks I have somebody from one of the organizations that are responsible for doing background checks of people, because people have accepted employment and gone to work in the government, and then are securing a clearance, a security clearance. And so I'm very pleased to give them my time when people come to do an interview about you, how you were as a person, how were you as a student, and so forth. General thoughts on, and just stepping back from the specific capstone project that we did this year. But I would say that the other effect that this class has had over, I've taught it now, I think this is the 4th time I've taught it, and at least third, maybe the 4th time I've taught it with Professor Nacht, is not only in your regard, but it's in fact, I think, how much I think the course has even been an opportunity for a kind of a course change in myself, thinking about these problems. And over the years, we've had a number of speakers, who are very distinguished professionals from the national labs, from the NNSA, come talk in the class or give colloquia in the nuclear engineering department. Of course, I've worked in that, worked at the lab there for many, many years. I remember one of the ones that I think was most thought-provoking was from a colleague of Professor Knox and myself, Bruce Goodwin. And he spent most of his career at Lawrence Livermore National Lab and spent many years as the principal associate director for the nuclear weapons program there. Stepped down a few years ago, and then worked in the sort of associate director at large, and then worked in the Center for Global Security Research for a number of years. And a very, a person who really follows modern trends and is able to read the sign of the times, very well informed. And the upshot of his talk, I thought, was very thought-provoking. In the time of 1942 to 1945, the Manhattan Project, there were really only 2 countries in the world, and certainly at that time just one country in the world, but very shortly followed by the Soviet Union, who had the wherewithal, who had the human capital, who had the foundational science base, who had the industrial base, who had, at that time, the most primitive of computational horsepower, all your foundational crafts and so forth, metallurgy and so forth, to have ever conceived and designed and tested a nuclear weapon. For many years, as one by one, the most advanced states, France and Britain and China and so forth, it was really a very elite club of countries that would have access to these extremely powerful and very horrific weapons. Over the years, in fact, already some time ago, as Bruce pointed out, states of lesser and lesser capability, lesser economic means, and so forth, have been able to wrest control of these things. And this thing is accelerating. He highlighted a couple of things in his talk. One of them is the fact that, of course, with the advent of the internet, so much quite sophisticated but now unclassified information is just out there. The second thing is that computational power, massive amounts of computational power, are not a commodity. Okay, this is supercomputing and so forth is not the sole province of just a few states, but any country in the world, even sort of third world countries, now have access to more than adequate amount of computation to design and build very sophisticated devices, nuclear weapons and so forth. The other thing he points out, which I think was very scary at the time, and I think is now just a fact of life, is that there's all kinds of technologies like additive manufacturing, 3D printing, metal 3D printing, and so forth, which now makes it capable to fabricate, parts of very unusual composition, very unusual shape, and so forth. As Scott Kemp pointed out, I think that I had not appreciated, in fact, until he gave the lecture, that the very first centrifuge that was ever made, in fact, worked extremely well, had a very high efficiency, in fact, required nothing more sophisticated than the student machine shop that's in the basement of Echeverry. In fact, it was not a very high-end device. It was just made out of standard aluminum pipe and lots of other things. And it had much better efficiency than more sophisticated things than people tried afterwards. The upshot of all of this is that a lot of the norms and a lot of the barriers that sort of prevented access to the club long ago are basically outmoded and even toothless. I think the whole architecture of export control, well, I think it's probably still a very good thing that we do have export control laws, but in fact, I think we're really, sort of shoveling against the tide here, precisely because the world trades we have such an open marketplace and so many things are kind of open source, and so many of these things people have access to be able to create parts and so forth, the sophistication, that it is no longer a very effective stanch against, against people doing sort of their own kind of indigenous weapons program. It is also true, and I think we certainly have a data point, that it's very possible for a reasonably sophisticated country to create a nuclear weapon with high confidence in its ability to function without even testing. As you've seen in the course, we even have there are ways of doing separation, uranium separation, that if one is reasonably careful, can completely elude detection by national technical means, as was the case of the Iraq program. They simply buried the power lines and did a mode of separation that we really had dismissed as that any country would do, but in fact they used to very high advantage. Jay Davis, who discovered this thing as part of the UNSCOM Team Force, said he was extraordinarily impressed with the sophistication of this. He said it was even much better than what we did in the Manhattan Project. Even technologies which we didn't talk about, like laser isotope separation, now even countries of laser technology and laser expertise are so prevalent that even countries of relatively modest sophistication could, if they so choose, pose a real threat in terms of doing this, which is very low, which has very low signature in terms of use of power and anything else. I think a country that put their mind to doing laser isotope separation, I think, and wanted to evade detection, I think could do so. We have on the other side of the equation the fact that I think the superpower status is now not what it used to be. I think many the sort of countries around the world are much more willing to challenge the role that the United States has had as a police force for trying to encourage good behavior around the world. Even in the conventional arena, you have their ability to build rockets, jets, cyber operations. You have countries now which in fact are, put their own satellites in orbit. Iran just had a satellite in orbit. North Korea put a satellite in orbit. India has actually landed something on the moon and so forth. So even in the conventional sphere, people used to say that the great superiority that the US had in conventional arms would also be a deterrent, against bad behavior elsewhere, is not necessarily, I think, sacrosanct anymore. So it strikes me, and I would not have believed I would have pivoted to this point of view half a dozen years ago. I found Brad Roberts' book very compelling. I hope you thought it, found it thought-provoking as well. That ultimately we need to come to the situation where, the controls of existing nuclear weapons is sort of ultimately a kind of a Maginot line. Ultimately, these weapons have to go, and they have to go completely. They have to go from even the superpowers and the former superpowers. There's no, if you think of it in terms of a mathematical function, there's no other point of stability other than the fact that they have to go. As I say, even 3 years ago, I could not have believed I would have said that, but I think, and I don't know, maybe Professor Nacht is going to give his own opinion of this, but I think there's no other point of stability than ultimately, signing on to the proposition that, Perry, Kissinger, Nunn, the Four Horsemen enunciated about 15 years ago in their Wall Street Journal article. Now, that raises an interesting question. I'm going to pose a question to the class right now. If you wanted a world that would be stable in a situation where there would be no, where I think you would have relative comfort with the idea of all nations, large and small, being willing to sign up to a regime of, I would say one would probably want vigorous sort of inspection and enforcement that there was no nuclear activities going on. What's the number one thing that a state, large or small, needs to secure its well-being without necessarily having a very large and sophisticated military? Let's see a hand go up, or somebody pipe up here. It's a 6-letter word. Am I on mute? How about you, Mansuk?
Why don't you listen a student's opinion first?
Okay.
So if you want to answer Professor Bieber's question, don't hesitate to unmute yourself and speak up. James.
Just to confirm, so the question you're asking is, given a world where we have heavy inspections in order to minimize, the risk of nuclear weapons persisting, what do we need besides a large conventional military?
No. What I'm saying is that along with forsaking our nuclear weapons, what would make all states relatively comfortable to allow or to permit inspections to ensure that there was no nuclear weapons program going on? And for that matter, what would even obviate the need for a massive conventional army as well? I mean, the US is $600, $700, $800 billion a year. We've got some 2-3 million men and women under arms, 11 carrier strike groups, satellites, organizations, hundreds of thousands of people, maybe 1 million civilians in the DoD. It's a huge fraction of our budget. What would make a nation comfortable to have a much smaller conventional army or armed services as well, as opposed to what many countries possess right now, in addition to this appetite for nuclear weapons? I'll give you a hint.
I think Max had a really good answer.
Well, I said allies. Actually, that is a good answer. But let me give you, well, again, this is a personal opinion. I don't claim to have the right answer, but the term I'm thinking of is also extremely responsive to another major problem that humanity has. What's the other biggie?
I have some complicated idea about your question. Probably not directly relevant to your question, but generally, U.S. needs to meet 2 criteria. One is that U.S. must preserve its independence of sovereignty, or independence of the freedom of decision. That means the U.S. should not be intervened by anyone in pursuing its national security, decisions, policies, or other policies. The second perspective is that U.S. must maintain a sufficient level of military force in order to preserve its influence overseas. Like United States is a kind of hegemony and hegemon, and U.S. is making somewhat hierarchical order, which is much more stable than anarchical order, and which is based on liberal democratic values, and based on somewhat relative authority or relationship with its allies. So to meet those 2 criteria, U.S. needs to maintain both types of forces. One is nuclear, the other one is conventional. Nuclear is to balance of Russia and China, maybe other potential nuclear threats. And the U.S. also needs to maintain large portion of conventional forces in order to deal with some medium or lower level conflict. So in my guess, there's no room to reduce U.S. forces, and that's a kind of a destiny. And when it compared to Athens and Roman Empire or Spanish Empire in 1500s, 1600s, and English Empire in 1800s, 1900s. So that's a destiny of kind of public goods provider. So U.S. wants to maintain its status as a public goods provider. In my guess, there is no room to reduce its military budget, and U.S. needs to accept such a kind of destiny. So I'm pretty with. So a couple of weeks ago, we heard, listened Cheryl Hinginer's guest lecture, and she presented some, some proposal plan for modernizing and developing new types of nuclear weapons, which have much lower yield. And I'm pretty with her, and I'm pretty with senior officers in DoD and Joint Chief of Staff about their plans to modernize U.S. military. So yeah, maybe my answer is not relevant to your question, but this is my own view.
In fact, thank you, Mansuk, because this is what makes this class so interesting. I'm actually getting old and woolly-headed and utopian. You're a senior military officer, and you're a very practical person. And in fact, I do agree with you in all points. I think it will. I will never see the day, I think, when we get to the point where the U.S. Is not playing the role of a kind of a policeman to. But I was making a more general point, and that is, what is the one thing, a commodity, that would, let me say, dramatically reduce the incentives to bad behavior, either the fear of bad behavior towards the sovereignty of the United States, or small state to small state interactions, whether it be in Eurasia or Africa or wherever. I'll give one. Oh, Lorenzo, Andrew, thank you. Energy, energy, clean, abundant energy that really allows countries to really have their own sort of commonweal in hand, largely within their boundaries. Now, never can a country operate in complete isolation, but so much of the problems we have in the world today are driven by the fact that countries need to schlep in massive amounts of oil every month through choke points like the Straits of Malacca and so forth. So this is the significant issue: is if a country had abundant energy at their own control, not with reliance on going through trading a rare form of energy that was subject to volatile price fluctuations, that didn't have to flow through maritime waterways that are kind of choke points that make you vulnerable to other countries. The world situation is a much better place. By the way, of course, if one can really get one's arms around the whole the issue of decarbonizing the atmosphere, and this is going to be a work not of decades, but a work of 1 or 2 centuries, and we're not suffering these episodic catastrophic events like these what are going to be just enormous tropical storms, desiccation of the equatorial regions, and so forth, which are also putting many countries into a bad way. This is also going to be reducing a point of tension as well. I'm fixated on this because although I've always been in the camp of the what they call the quote unquote all of the above, i.e. to attack the problem of energy and the environment, one really cannot afford to exclude anything, and certainly not nuclear. And I'm sort of a proponent of research in solar, hydro, geo, wind, and so forth. The reality is that in my mind, the one change maker, the one that could be a game changer, is happening right now at MIT. Many of you may have heard a colloquium given by a very close friend and colleague of mine, Dennis White. He's actually given a couple of talks at Berkeley in the past few years, former chair of nuclear engineering department there, who is leading what in my mind is probably I think people don't realize it, but perhaps the most consequential applied science program going on in the world right now. He and his team and a spin-off company, which has a very close relationship with MIT called Commonwealth Fusion, believe they have a very rapid path, a short sprint to commercial fusion, clean, no residual, very little residual activity form of energy. One just gets the deuterium out of seawater, and that this is the kind of thing that could put gigawatts and gigawatts and gigawatts onto the grid in close proximity with daycare centers. And if one and this is going to be, I think we're going to see the results of this in about 5 years. I think the proof of the pie is in the pudding. They're very well capitalized. The Founders Fund, all the Bill Gates and all the big players in the world are putting large bets on him. They're making very compact, a very, very, very compact fusion reactor based on high temperature superconductors. All the goodness of these devices goes as the fourth or fifth power of the magnetic field, which they're going to double over large behemoths like the ITER facility, which is like the building of the pyramids, both in cost and time and size. This is the kind of science discovery that great research universities are capable of, that can affect almost overnight changes in the world in the same way that fission did in 1938. Okay. Now, I'm a physicist of a rather woolly stripe, and I've gotten a little bit smitten by this thing, but I'm a big fan of this. One of my recent PhDs, Namika Namani, actually went to work for Commonwealth Fusion as a postdoc, which he did for a while. But if you were looking for another avenue to devote your career to, that would have enormous secondary effect on security, it's energy, both in terms of the direct, the impact in reducing incentives towards bad behavior. Why it's necessary for one country to all of a sudden, begin to, exercise territorial superiority over large bodies of international water. All that goes away. You want to make minerals, you want to make medical isotopes, you want energy for manufacturing. It's all there. A large but not complete, incentivization towards bad behavior goes away. And then secondly, I think this is the kind of thing that also I think would go a long way to reversing the other great peril we have. Let me turn it over to Professor Nacht, unless there's conversation. This is just my 2 cents. As I say, I'm maybe getting old and woolly in the head, but Professor Nacht.
Okay, thank you. Well, those were very thoughtful and provocative remarks. I'm not going to quite go in the same direction, although I'd like to start out by saying again what a pleasure it is, what an honor it is for me to share the course with Professor Van Bibber, world-class nuclear physicist, an expert on nuclear technology, and a delightful human being. And I've always learned a ton every year from the class, and it's sharpened my thinking on all kinds of issues related to nuclear security. I wanted to begin with a sort of initial thinking, taking off in the present, which is in the US, Trump has a plan to spend about $50 billion per year over the next 10 years, 500 billion in this decade, to modernize US nuclear strategic forces. We have bombers that go back to the 60s with the B-52, although we have the B-2 and the B-1. Nuclear submarines and ICBMs all need replacements. Now, a question I have is, in the aftermath of the pandemic, if there is very serious economic damage done to the country, which remains a little uncertain, if the Oxford group comes up with a vaccine and we're all vaccinated next spring and this thing disappears, that would be fantastic. If the Gilead medicine reduces the time to recover from the virus, that would be great. All of that will limit the damage to the economy. But if not, we could be in for the 1930s replacing the 2020s. We could have a decade of economic depression.
Yeah.
I don't want it to happen. I hope it doesn't happen, but it could happen. And even if it's somewhere in between, somewhere not as bad as that, but pretty bad, it'll place enormous pressure on the budget of the United States, the need to resurrect the economy. I just saw today or yesterday that Ford Motor just reported a $5 billion loss, $5 billion with a B loss for this quarter. Even Ford can't sustain $5 billion losses every quarter. No company can. The millions of small businesses in the country. Again, reading the one projection is that half the retail stores in the United States in shopping centers will be out of business in 1 year. This is another recent projection. So if we still have this sort of major impact on our macroeconomic situation, I find it, and we don't have new sources of conflict, I don't foresee an ability of the government to sustain that kind of investment in nuclear weapon modernization because of the major claims on the budget to help out, to restore pension plans, on all aspects of human life in the United States. Now, it's not as though we're alone here, right? Russia is now seeing major impact on the virus. I just was reading that they now have evidence of the virus spreading to the Russian Arctic region. Will this make fundamental changes to the calculations of Putin and Xi Jinping? Changes to the calculation of the Ayatollah in Iran? How will this affect fundamental thinking of the nation's leaders, and particularly nations who are adversarial to the United States? If they significantly modify their aspirations, that will make it easier for the United States to reduce its own investment in nuclear weapons. I still think we're a ways away from the Perry, Kissinger, Schultz, Nunn dream of getting rid of nuclear weapons, although you never know. I mean, who would have thought this pandemic would happen in 1 month and do the damage that it did? So never say never. But I think to me, it seems a little unlikely that we're about to get rid of nuclear weapons. For the US, I think at the moment, it remains the ultimate insurance policy against an attack by an adversary. Now, one point that was triggered by what Professor Van Bibber said about energy, I agree completely. Energy could be a game changer if it's ubiquitous and available and provides all the necessary requirements for every nation state. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't change human behavior and the parts of real human beings in charge of real governments and their own aspirations. And I think, let's say, if we were totally independent of an energy need on any dimension, and so was Russia, would that change Putin's attitudes about Russia's aspirations or Chinese aspirations to strengthen the reclaiming of the Chinese civilization prior to the 200 years of being suppressed by the British? I tend to doubt it. I think human behavior may be more difficult to change than energy. to change. So, I mean, one reading of human history is there's been a 5,000-year struggle for major control and dominance in the world. Empires have come, empires have gone. We don't quite have an empire now, but we sure have a strong American influence around the world, but it's not going to last forever. And, you know, as some said, would you want to, if you don't care about the US leading the world, would you prefer a world led by Russia or a world led by China? I personally would not. I don't see a plausible alternative to the United States that's preferable at the moment. So I think you have these cross-cutting concerns. Now, just a little bit further about the pandemic. I mean, it's extraordinary what we've witnessed just since March 1st. March 1st in this country. You have the total shutdown of the American economy. We've already seen in the states that are beginning to open up, of course, it's just in the earliest stages, but in Georgia, in Texas, and elsewhere, that even if the state governor says, let's open up, it doesn't mean that customers are going to walk into the stores. They're going to be very risk averse about putting their own lives on the line just to satisfy important but secondary economic needs. Economic needs are very important, but they're secondary to life itself. And it could be quite a long time before we're able to restore what appears to be normal economic activity. And without the restoration of normal economic activity, you won't have the restoration of the budget balancing, and you won't have the sources available to build fancy new submarines and bombers. So I do think we have sort of slipped into a world-class revolutionary situation. The most significant development in the last 100 years, possibly including the 2 world wars, that can affect every facet of human life if it doesn't get checked in place by a vaccine or and other medication. Now, a lot of this we'll get an early indicator of it, of the impact, just in the election in 6 months in this country. Because this will be a kind of referendum on Trump's rule. And if the American people vote to reelect him, and I think there's a decent chance they will, then I think Trump, in a second term, without any constraints about concern about his reelection, may embark on all kinds of new policies, but I think that would include spending $50 billion a year on new nuclear weapons. If, however, Trump is defeated, I think Biden would be much less willing to do that and would divert resources to domestic economic and social concerns. Plus, there's another possibility is we don't have an election. Trump could postpone the election, although that's considered illegal. Doesn't necessarily stop him from doing it. He could postpone the election, or he could lose the election and claim it's a fraud and not accept the results of the election and still refuse to leave. These are all considered impossible events in the pre-Trump era. I would say none of them are impossible in the Trump era. Anything is possible in the Trump era. And it makes forecasting that much more challenging and difficult. It gives great opportunities for the students who are going to go into this unknown world to figure out what they want to do with their careers. I think clearly nuclear energy and nuclear weapons and nuclear security are going to be with us for quite a long time. It's just a matter of being flexible and adjusting to the changing circumstances. And I agree with President Bibber totally that we try to give you the opportunity to become more knowledgeable in this field, and a bunch of you would actually go to work in the national security labs of DOE or in other important pieces of the US government, in the intelligence community, or with groups like the International Atomic Energy Agency, or on congressional staffs, or in the federal government. So those are some of my thoughts. I mean, I've been doing this kind of work, teaching and getting involved in real policy work now for over 40 years. And this is by far, just in the last month, the most significant development for our country, for the world, myself, and my family that I've experienced. Hands down, there's nothing in the number 2 position. Because I wasn't active during the Second World War, I was a little bit post-Second World War. But this has a potential to just have extraordinary impact on every facet of human life. And I hope that folks at Oxford and Gilead and elsewhere can short circuit my concerns and bring an end to this. That would be wonderful, but I'm not so sure. So I leave that open to our students. You're younger, you're full of hope and ambition and energy, all of which I have in short supply now. So I'd love to hear your comments and criticisms of that. Any thoughts?
So just kind of building on that, not overly relevant to the material we've directly covered in this class, but something that was striking to me about the lasting impact of all of this is the other day I talked to my mother on the phone, and she was describing my older brother lives less than 10 minutes away from them in Alabama, which is one of the states that's beginning to open up right now.
Right.
And they had not, so my family had not seen my nieces and nephews for a month and a half. And for my brother's and sister-in-law's anniversary last weekend, they took my nieces and nephews and just had them at the house for a day. And my mom said that the reaction was she had to actually coax my nieces and nephews to be willing to get near them, just because they had been in isolation for so long that they were legitimately concerned about getting near people because they had been told for so long that they weren't supposed to. And so there's just this lasting psychological impact, I think, that all of this is going to have on this younger generation as well, even though we don't necessarily realize it, because most of the events that have been building up have been neglecting the impact on the younger generation because there's not as much of a health risk. So I just thought that was a really eye-opening realization.
Right. I agree completely. And I think it's not limited to the younger generation wanting to see their relatives in Alabama, but consumers all around the country who are very risk averse about going into stores and bowling alleys and concert halls and massage parlors and factories to resume their activities. I think it's going to take a while, especially because now they can monitor. Everyone's monitoring the coronavirus rate and the death rate and seeing if it goes up. They don't want to be part of those statistics. Sorry, I've just got to get the door here. Sorry. Wonderful. That was a very useful anecdote, James. Do you think the most people in Alabama support opening up, besides your nephews and nieces?
It's complicated. I think they're wanting limited opening up. Alabama was actually a very proactive stance in that they didn't implement as strict of a policy as we did, but despite having cases later, they shut down universities and stuff right about when we did. So they've had a far lower count. And so most people at this point, because there's also a high poverty rate there, being in the deep South, a lot of people want to go back to work. But I think they're doing it in a very cautious manner, I think.
Uh-huh.
So.
That's encouraging.
So if I could, Professor Knox, I'd like to push back a little bit on that. In that a couple of years ago, I read a memoir from a lady who was in Sarajevo during the siege, and she described being in line one day for cooking oil while an artillery shell hit the block. And so what happened is everybody in line ran around and they checked all the wounded and they did what they needed to do to stay safe. And then they reformed the line. In that people adjust to amazingly tragic things and make them the new normal very quickly. So I don't know that the coronavirus is going to be the end of how we do things. I think it's just going to change.
Right. Well, I agree. I'm not saying it's going to end it, but it's going to change it in possibly fundamental and unpredictable ways.
Just, you know, and I think some of the most interesting conversations I've had in recent weeks have been with people about the what turn the coronavirus might take, but to have a more, I think, nuanced view of it. I think when you look at the comparison between this and what happened in 1918, where in the spring of 1918 and in the fall, early winter, you know, the country was 4 times smaller population. It was, but we had at that time upwards of 1 million people who died. I think it was probably 700,000 people who died or so. Now, we didn't have the luxury of, certain municipalities shut down or took protective measures as they could, but we had a wartime economy going on, and men had to work in factories, and people at the factories were dying. We obviously didn't have anywhere near the medical system or the virological knowledge, immunology, and all these other things that we have today. So we were, I think, completely at the mercy of this Spanish flu. On the other hand, as of early winter, late winter of 1919, it completely vanished and never made a reappearance, ever. This thing, and I'm talking with people who, I attend a lot of seminars online from UCSF and so forth about this thing, and talk with people on our own MCB program. This coronavirus turns out to be extremely slowly mutating, very slowly, which is good. And second of all, I think as you already begun the limited testing we've done in sort of the largest municipalities, you actually find that 1/4 of the people already have been exposed to it. Largely the opinions of the biologists and immunologists that I've talked to basically say that it's highly probable that if you've been exposed to it even once and have never been symptomatic, that that effectively is your shot. That basically is your is going to give you immunity for a very long time, if not for lifetime. So there's a reasonable probability that a year from now we'll look back and just say, I don't think we would regret being very prudent in a way that we couldn't back in 1918, but there is a possibility this thing just could go away. But I'm not going to put any bets.
Fantastic, if true.
Yeah.
So I have one question for both of you that I've been thinking a lot about in light of the coronavirus on my more pessimistic days. And it's just that the realization that this virus in less than 4 months has done more damage to the global community than probably, I would say, every other act of terrorism ever committed. And yet technology for doing things such as this is becoming ever increasingly more available. Granted, I don't know the exact level, but because medical technology is increasing, it's bound to happen sooner rather than later, that terrorist organizations will have this capability. Granted, governmental organizations utilizing this type of offensive capabilities would likely be negated by this because the realization that containing it's very difficult. It seems very almost probable that terrorist organizations, which are intending to cause mass mayhem, would start to resort to this rather than trying to deal with nuclear capabilities, which at this point we can detect more readily. Do you think that there's an increased likelihood that this becomes the next terrorist go-to because of seeing the damage it's inflicted?
This is Michael. I mean, again, it's pure conjecture. Of course, for radical extremist groups to see what a virus could do to the United States in 1 month would make them salivate in terms of trying to inflict it more widely and more deeply on the United States in the future. But I don't see quite how they get from that aspiration to having the capability to do it. I mean, it's true, they have sought to connect with biological weapons experts in laboratories in different countries. We've been studying for a long time, really since before 9/11, the prospect of a terrorist biological weapons effort, but it's been 20 years. It hasn't happened yet. Doesn't mean it won't happen tomorrow afternoon, but it looks as though it's not as easy to translate their aspirations into a real capability.
I will second that. And interestingly, nature did something which even relatively sophisticated people have tried and failed to do. It's actually, people have actually tried to, to vectorize and weaponize pathogens, and just found it more difficult than, to do in a broad, wide-scale way than they thought, and very often did more harm to themselves than to anybody else. This one just came out of left field, and we don't know whether it was sloppy work in a laboratory or whether it was a market or whether it was just purely natural. We don't know that. But this one, I don't think there was any ill intent.
Mm-hmm.
This is just the way these things happen.
Right. I would like to ask the class, the students in the class, whether they've thought, what is the impact of the pandemic on your own career plans and aspirations? Does it have any particular effect, or problem too hard, or no change, or what?
Hi, this is Aidan. For me personally, I had begun exploring new work within the public sector outside of my current federal position. And with the pandemic, as it's well known, state jobs are drying up, jobs in education are closing down, openings even within the federal government are not being filled as quickly. So I'm noticing that there will probably be a lapse between the pandemic and my actual start of the career that I was planning. But I think I am also lucky because I do have some work lined up, but I do think it will have, I read an analysis and I agree with it. Like people of my generation have experienced not only the Great Recession when we were younger, which depressed our parents' earnings and decreased opportunities in that aspect, but also ourselves are experiencing a second recession now, just when we were starting our careers. And some wonder if our generation will be unable to achieve as much because of those factors.
Right. Well, Aidan, though, you've been involved with the Department of Homeland Security, right?
That is correct.
So that's probably going to be a growth stock, I would think. I can't imagine DHS's budget declining.
Yeah, I wouldn't expect it to decline either. The sub-agency I work for, though, has had some budgetary issues within the DHS. So
I see. Okay. Anybody else on their own reflections on their career as a consequence of the pandemic?
The U.S. Navy's always hiring nuclear engineers.
At least up to now.
I have a question. So last week we have seen a very extraordinary some phenomena that oil prices became negative, like $50. So now oil price is so low, and do you think such a the very cheap price of oil would impact other energy sources, the use of other energy sources like sunlight or wind or nuclear energy? So would impact our some future use of eco-friendly energy sources?
This is Ivo. I think in the discussion of using green energy, we always have to factor in the environmental cost. And if you just look at the economic cost, it's always preferred to use gas or oil. But I mean, of course, everyone acknowledges that the environmental cost is very expensive for non-green type of energy. So I think the same rationale is still remain despite how cheap oil is. But I think it would deter a lot of funding for startups if the price for oil is that cheap.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to offer, this is James again. I'm going to offer a bit of a counter perspective in that I think that the environmental issues are still going to be there. But I think that especially in light of the economic downturn, the fact that oil prices are low and are lower than previously, and there was already the incentive to use oil because it was already cheaper than wind and gas, than wind and solar, that just the increase in the disparity between the prices and the fact that we're in such an economic recession right now has the impact to cause significant turning back towards fossil fuel, unfortunately. I believe, I can't remember the exact data points, but I believe that there's been a historical back and forth as you see the fluctuations in the gas prices and how there's been investment into clean energy. Granted, we're still in the earlier years of clean energy actually being viable, so those data points aren't necessarily even relevant at this point. But I believe that the monetary difference in light of the current economic issues we're experiencing are likely to highlight that.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I agree with a lot of what James said, because fundamentally the way the American government is approaching the bailouts and the structure of the systems we are doing, it goes against a lot of like what we hear sometimes from, I think, Democrats when they talk about that we could save the environment or there are ways to counteract climate change. Honestly, I think that most of the data indicates that no matter what we do, the amount of oil we already have in reserves / being drilled will, no matter what, push us past that point of no return. So really what we're now having to ask ourselves is, do we even want to do mitigation efforts, which is what we need to start thinking about. And I think the whole idea of let's stop climate change is no longer going to be applicable because of the way, partly also because this pandemic will cause us to want to return too quickly to the older normals.
Folks, I see it's set to 3:15 now, and we wanted to allow you 15 minutes to do the course evaluation. So if no one objects, I think we should terminate this discussion and turn it over to you guys to do your course evaluation.
Thanks for the reminder, Michael. Very good. And Mansukh, they're all basically trained on, this is a link they go to or a form you send out? It's a link.
Yes, sir. So I assume that every student has received the letter from GSPP or College of Engineering about the course evaluation. Is that right? Andrew, did you get the course link, evaluation link? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Yeah. So students already know how to evaluate the course. So we can leave them to do the course evaluation. And professors, if you don't mind, do you want to have a separate meeting both four of us?
A separate meeting now?
Yeah, if you want, I can make the small discussion room for four of us.
All right, just to discuss grading?
And grading and logistics.
Okay, let me be back in a second and I'll join you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, professors.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful semester. This has been an amazing class. So by far, actually, I would say my most rewarding class in my entire graduate curriculum. So.
Wow, thank you very much.